All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to our first Poetry Out Loud recitation workshop. My name is Amara Faring. I am the Community Development and Arts Learning Specialist for the Wyoming Arts Council. And in this role, I am also the coordinator for the Wyoming Poetry Out Loud. And today I have brought with me awesome and wonderful Wyoming poet Mandie Hines. Mandie is a wonderful poet, knows how to recite. I'm always taken with her recitation, so I thought she would be a great one to learn from. So welcome, Mandie. We're excited to have you.
Thank you so much, Amara. It's great to be here. I, as you said, am a poet and author, and I have been in poetry for a handful of years now. I always feel so surprised that I'm in this world of poetry because it was not part of my plan. I always wanted to be a writer, but poetry took me by surprise and took over my life, and I love it. I love it so much, and I love poetry out loud. And to be honest, the only reason I think that I recite poems now is because I got to judge poetry out loud, and I just was so impressed with the students. And also in judging, I kind of wanted to push myself because I thought, if these students are doing this, shouldn't I ask myself to try to do that too for them? Since they are performing, I want to do something special for them. So that really is what inspired the shift of just reading poetry to try to recite. And I don't recite all the time. I do lots of poetry readings, but I host poetry open mics, and I like to do both because they are different styles, they have different moods. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is poetry recitation and this awesome competition of poetry out loud. It's so wonderful. So before I talk about the recitation, I want to touch briefly on poem selection, because it is so important for the whole process. And you may already have your poems chosen, but I want you to think about why you chose those poems. And one thing that I think is the most important thing about poetry or poem selection is the connection between you and the poem. So think about, do you hear your own voice or your own story in the poem that you selected? Does it have meaning to you? Because this will be so important in memorizing the poem and then building that connection between you and the audience when you perform. Now, I have one tip that I picked up from former US Poet Laureate Ted Kooser that I always felt, I came across this and I thought, I have to share this, but also I have to put like a big caution on it, because it's such good advice and it has such big pitfalls to it too. So Ted Kooser says that rhyme and meter are great devices for memorizing poems because they're mnemonic devices, and it just makes it easier to memorize. But here's the pitfalls. Ted Kooser, he read his poems in many places all the time. His poems are beautiful, but he was not a spoken word artist. And that is the art of bringing the poetry and the performance together. And so when you are talking about poetry performance, one of the pitfalls of rhyme and meter is that it's easy to fall into that sing-songy pattern, that cadence, which is very distracting. And then the other part is that rhyme lends itself to hitting rhymes hard, because a lot of times they're right at the end of the line. And so you tend to overemphasize those rhymes. So there's something to think about. You could choose a poem with rhyme and meter and make it easier on yourself for memorizing, but you have to be cautious about those other two things, because the whole point of recitation in this competition is to highlight the poem and your understanding, and you don't want to do anything that detracts from that. So the second part that we'll go into is mapping poems. Hopefully you've heard about mapping, or your teacher has talked to you about mapping poems, but what mapping a poem is you take the poem and you want to highlight words, phrases, anything that impacts the overall mood and theme. There are notations for you as you're learning the poem that you go line by line and think about, what does this line make me feel, and what do I want to project onto the audience? What do I want to relay to them in reciting this line? Then you want to do things like look for points that you want to have pauses, make notes about your pacing, points of emphasis, places you want to hit a word, places you want to get louder, places that you want to get softer. Highlight punctuation that's naturally there, but also add punctuation, like make a comma where you want to have a pause, or a big slash that will just note to you, take a moment, take a beat here before going into the next place. You can also make markings, and they can be your own symbols on facial expressions that you might want to have in a certain point to relay something. But don't overdo facial expressions. You don't want to be over dramatic or over theatrical, but you are just thinking for nuances, things that just add a little meaning. And then also when you're mapping out your poem, you can put where you want to have gestures. Think about, how can you add meaningful gestures? And for Poetry Out Loud, you want to be very conservative with how many gestures you use. A good mark is maybe 3 to 5, just to add meaning. If it doesn't add meaning, if it doesn't convey something, don't add it. But they can help with the understanding. So the whole idea of mapping is really to start spending time with the poem. You want to make sure that you understand it. You want to make sure that you understand every word. If you don't understand a word, look it up, because some of the words have different meanings. They're an older poem, so they might not have the same meaning now as when the poet wrote it. So that is important to understand. And the pronunciation of the word. There are lots of words that maybe even as readers that we know, we look at, we're familiar with, but we never have to say out loud to somebody. So a good resource is Google. You can look it up either in the dictionary, or a lot of times you can just Google, how do I pronounce, and then have a word. Ask your teachers. There are resources, but it's important that you have the correct pronunciation of words. And let's see, some other things are highlight words that you want to deliver with specific vocal energy and physical energy. Again, don't be too dramatic. So you're working on memorizing. How I personally do it, you can look up articles on quick tips on memorizing poems, but I think that it comes down to the person. Some people have these quick tips, but I think it's just that they're good at memorizing, right? I don't think that there's a universal, these are how you memorize something quickly. But I will tell you my process. I like to, especially if you're going to do the mapping, copy the poem, make the font big. That way you can see the words and your notes at the same time and have space between there. Because as you are memorizing, you'll want to have your poem in front of you and you'll want to glance down and look up. So I do a read through a few times, all the way through, looking straight at the page. I don't even attempt to, I'm just trying to get used to the words, the patterns, the cadence, all of that. Then I'll start at the beginning and think about how one line connects into the other, the meaning of it, and that will help you start memorizing. Why does one line feed into the other? You're telling a story, and so you're just remembering the order of events of the story. And then, you know, start with the first couple lines, and then you'll get the first stanza, and then the same with, as you're thinking about how one line leads into the next, how does one stanza lead into the next? And just do it over and over again. And you could do pretty well in, maybe half an hour. You could probably get one of those poems started, laying it down. And what you're trying to do, and why it's so important to pick out poems that you're connected to, is you're trying to internalize that poem. You want to essentially write it into your bones. You want it to become part of you, so that it is just a telling of the poem. You're just performing it, and it's going to be a part of you. So the pressure isn't going to be so much remembering it, because it will just be so much a part of you that it comes naturally when you go to recite it. One of the things that I noticed when I started thinking about talking about recitation is the Poetry Out Loud scoring. So, Amara, you can correct me if I get any of this wrong, but I believe there is a total of 41 points. 8 of those points are accuracy. And the reason I want to emphasize this is because that's like the accuracy is 25% of your total score. This is the only part that you have absolute control over. Everything else, there's a rubric, but it is subjective. Like, each judge they have the wiggle room. They know what it's supposed to look like, but they have their own interpretation. The accuracy is what it is. It's, if you can get every single word, then that is an automatic 25% that you've already scored yourself. It's so awesome. So nail your accuracy first. That's the most important thing. And then bring along the other elements as you go. So I have some tips on how to do this, because accuracy is not just hitting every word. It is making sure that the audience hears every word. And it is so easy to lose your little words, the little articles, the little connectors. So here's what I was coming up with when I was thinking about what are things that I do, what are things that I think would help you guys in this competition. And the first is to get comfortable reciting your poem in front of a mirror. That's the first place to start. If you can't look at yourself in the mirror and get through that awkwardness of, oh my God, I'm reciting a poem, and it's just kind of a weird, uncomfortable feeling. And it is weird, at least for me, to have my family in the house and I'm in the room practicing a poem, and I have to just shake it off. They know what I'm doing. They don't care. But it's kind of weird. So get comfortable with doing that. And then you're going to start wanting to do it in front of audiences. This could be your pet, which is pretty, easy. Then start with your family, with friends. If you have the opportunity in your community, do an open mic. This is one of my favorites, because there are retirement homes and senior centers everywhere, and there are so many residents in those places that love poetry. And I know if you contact like their activities director or somebody with that facility, they will let you come in and read in front of their residents. So it's just like one more venue. Like, if you can just get the practice and start shaking out some of those nerves, you will do yourself such a service in preparing for these competitions. And when you perform your poem, speak in a natural way. Don't get caught up in the line breaks. The line breaks can be misleading, because if you're paying too much attention to your line breaks, that can be one of the reasons why you're hitting a rhyme too hard in a poem that has rhyme. And here's something interesting. I just had to do a recording of some of my poems, and I recorded them, until they sounded just right. So I do this all the time, but I was thinking about it in particular to what you guys will be doing. And I came up with some things that I hope will help you. So first, record your poems, whether it's on your phone, you can do it like a video, or you can just do an audio recording. And then what you'll want to do is take your printed poem and listen to it back and see if you missed any words. And again, think about the A, the with, and don't forget that you have to have your title and the author's name. And then if there's a translator, you have to hit all of those points, because those can be deducted from your accuracy if you miss any of those. So then after you do that, and you check also to see if you added words or if you skipped lines or whatever, you're going to check for all those mistakes. The other thing is compare it to your tonal map that you made of the poem. Are you conveying the feelings and ideas that you noted? Are you hitting the parts hard that you wanted to? Are you being softer with other parts? Did you get the pacing right? And for a lot of people, not all people, some people are just a little bit more dramatic in how they speak and how they perform. But there's a lot of people who are just softer in the way they speak. And you just have to push yourself. You got to turn the dial more than you realize. It's kind of like stage makeup for theater, right? You put on way more makeup than you think that you have to. That is, for some people, the way poetry performance is. You got to dial it way up compared to what you think you would have to. You think, oh, I'm being over dramatic and I'm not supposed to be over dramatic, but that might be what you as a poet need to do. And same with pacing is, you might think, oh, I am going so slow, but you might actually be really rushing through it. And that's what recording will help you determine is, are you presenting it in the way that you think you are when you're reciting it? So then after you've checked to see if you're missing words or adding words, and you're comparing it to your tonal map, then record it again. And when you think you have a really good recording, set it aside for like half an hour. Just walk away and then come back and focus on listening. Don't think about the words. Don't think about the performing of it. I want you to just listen and see if you can hear that there are words that you're dropping, or that bump into the next word to where it gets blurred in. One word gets blurred into the next, because these are things that you have the words there, but they're not enunciated enough. So that if you work on all of those things, accuracy, I'm telling you, will take you such a long way. I think that if you can get all three of your poems 100% accurate, that might be enough to take you all the way through state. I mean, it is that important. So after you get a little bit more comfortable with your poems, the next thing that I think is important is your posture. It will help, besides the fact that it impacts your score, it can also be a place that sets you up for a good performance. So one of the things that I like to think of is, imagine that you have a string pulling you up from the top of your head. That will kind of give you that taller position, right? And then imagining being grounded through your feet. Now you've created this space. And then the other thing that I really think is important is spread your shoulders. When we are nervous and have anxiety about performance, we have a tendency to start shrinking in, and that's why the lifting up and then the grounding down and then the opening up. If you occupy a good space, like just a big square space, it exudes confidence to your audience. Even if you're not sure if you have that confidence, it's already telling the judges, the audience, that you belong in the space and you are ready to perform. Pay attention to me, because here I am. So it's just such a good thing to start out with. And then You don't have to start until you're ready. So take in a big breath, focus on the connection you have with that poem, and then breathe out your nerves, because now you are just here for the poem. It is all about the presentation of this poem. So things to give attention to your poems. Hard stops. That's a sudden pause in a poem for effect. And it's often after the poem has built momentum and speed. And it gives your audience a chance to catch their breath and process what they've just heard. And it's usually signifies, hey, I just said something really important. Pay attention. I'm going to stress again that it's important for the audience to hear every single word. Enunciate and create spaces between your words. Even when you're speeding, you want to make sure there's that space in between each word. You don't want them to cram into each other. Give attention to words that illustrate their meaning. Words like fangs, stomp, giggle, blaring, water, breath, breathe, buzz, all these types of things, they do the work for you. And if you just give them a little attention in how you say them, then it just highlights those. Breathing is also important. It helps pacing. It can add emotion. I would avoid the sharp inhale. It's when you get a rhythm, there are a lot of poets, especially spoken word poets, who do that sharp inhale because they are saying their words so quickly and they're trying to get everything out, and then they got to take that inhale so they can get started again. But you want to be careful about your breathing, because one, you don't want to pass out, and two, because it is just one of those unspoken things that can add a lot to your poem. If you take out the breath, it can add an urgency and emotion to it. If you add a breath and a silent, and by breath, I really mean you take the breath, but there's silence. It gives the audience a time to process what they've heard. It's kind of highlighting an area as important. The ending of a poem. Think about how the poem is winding down. How are you alerting the audience that it's coming to an end? And if your poem is even, if it's monotone, you haven't done it right. You want to have variations in your performance. Hear yourself. And I truly mean hear yourself reciting the poem. Because if you're not listening to the poem, one, I think, well, why would the audience be listening to it? But also, you'll miss what you're trying to say. So some bad habits that take away from a performance. I've already spoken about a few of those, but failure to project your words. Projection is so important, and it's different than yelling. A lot of people think they're projecting and they're just yelling, and yelling comes from the throat. Projecting comes from your diaphragm. Pacing, going too fast. And in certain circumstances, I have heard poets go too slow, and it's just goes so slow. And it's interesting because most people, if you stretch it out and you go slower than you think you need to, that actually works. That actually is what you need to do, because it's something about being on stage that you think you're going slow. Time is just different when you're on stage. And this is one of the reasons why recording yourself really helps you tell how you're actually performing it versus how you think you're performing it. Okay, this is another bad one. Adding accents, or singing, or doing the sing-songy cadence, improper inflection, an excessive emoting, which is interesting because, spoken word artists, they emote a lot. And I am a big fan of emoting, but you don't want it to be theatrical. You don't want it to take away from the poem. And in Poetry Out Loud, it is a little bit dialed down from some other spoken word performances. Fidgeting. Fidgeting, you really got to start, whether that's moving your feet back and forth, or excessive gestures, or moving your hands back and forth when you are trying to keep them at your sides. You have to be careful about that. And mispronunciations is another bad habit. So good recitation includes good projection, good pacing with proper pauses, voice inflection, evidence of understanding, and that comes from spending time with your poem. Correct pronunciation, and then composure. So I think that covers the basics. I hope that that's helpful and will get you all started. We're doing another workshop later that will talk more about performance on a big stage, and we'll talk about the final polishing of the performance, the actual performance of poems. But I hope these are good tips that will get you started and help you on the path of memorizing your poems. Amara, is there anything that you have to ask or that I left out?
I was just changing the tiles so that we were next to each other on my screen. I think that was awesome. I think you covered so much and such great tips for recitation. On your journey to recite, because I know that you and I have talked about that wasn't always what you've done. How do you combat nerves? How do you learn to emote in a good way when you're nervous? I think is one of the questions that I have.
Okay, so let's see. I combat nerves by practicing. That is it's such a simple or obvious, or I hate even throwing that out as advice, but honestly, that is the best way, is you practice over and over and over and over again. And when you have emotions, if you are doing that practicing, if there's anything that's too emotional, that's what helps you start learning how to control that emotion and what you allow through and what you hold back. And I do a lot of poems on grief. So I have a hard time. They're my poems. So they are not just something that resonates with me, but they are my personal, most vulnerable things that I'm sharing with complete strangers. And that's one of the reasons I say practice in front of as many different audiences as you can, because there is something about, you can practice on your own and be in control of your emotions. And then suddenly having strangers listening to this thing that is vulnerable, that is important to you, suddenly will cause you to have a reaction that you haven't had before. And I've had that even in my writing group, where we're all friends, we've been friends for years, and someone will bring something to the group and they'll start crying, and they will say, "I'm so sorry, I don't know why this is making me cry. I have no idea." It's just that vulnerability of sharing something out loud with people. And so it is the practicing and then the varied audience that will help you prepare, because it also lets you know how people react. Audience will start reacting in similar fashion, not every time, but it will give you an idea on what people are reacting to, and it will allow you to build in a pause where people will laugh or gasp or whatever reaction people have. It's so cool with poetry. It's unlike other things because people have audible reactions to poetry. It's so cool. And so those different types of audiences will help you learn to predict how, you know, your performance is going to be perceived by this bigger audience when you perform. And it's good to know, I need to wait just another second because people think this part is funny. And also, there are times in a poem that you think that it's very serious and people will find it funny. They're surprised by it, maybe, and that's what's funny. And so you just want to be able to gauge those reactions and be prepared for them and leave space for them.
I think that's great advice. And I think too, when you are practicing and you continue to do it, it also grows your performance, right? Like where you start is basic compared to where you end up when you're practicing, right? I mean, you're growing your performance every time you do it. And so, yeah, I completely agree. I think that that's perfect advice.
Yeah.
So,
and one thing that I want to touch on, because I talked about the nerves, but one thing that I think a lot of people experience is they haven't done something like this before. They don't think that they should be in this space. They don't think that they deserve it. They don't think they have the experience. They don't think all these different fear reactions can make you feel uncomfortable in performing. And having personally felt like an imposter in so many spaces that I have filled, here's what I know that I can tell you. The fact that you said yes to taking on this challenge means that you deserve to be here and fill up this space and do this performance. So let that be an assurance that I am telling you, you deserve to be here, and don't let that fill your mind. Just get rid of the thought right now. It doesn't exist.
I love that so much. And I could not have said it better. Man, yeah, take up space. We're excited to have you all. Come join us. You know, if you're also looking for, as you're going through these steps that Mandie has given you, which are superb steps, as you're going through them, you know, make sure you check out the Poetry Out Loud YouTube page. They have lots and lots of students that they've recorded reciting poems for Poetry Out Loud. So you can also kind of get a flavor of what you're aiming for as well. So that's another resource for you as you're kind of breaking down your poems and getting to know them. Mandie, do you have anything else you want to add to this workshop? I mean, I know you said we will be coming back together later in February to talk about, you know, being on a big stage and what all that looks like. But do you have anything else you would like to add as far as getting started in your recitations?
Yeah, you know, there is my mom always has this advice that my whole life, no matter what I'm trying to do, she tells it and gives me this advice, and it can be triggering. So people are opposed to this, but the thing that honestly has worked is she always says, fake it until you make it. So even if you don't feel confident, just pretend that you do. You'll watch these different recitations and people look so confident, and you're like, you might think, oh, that's not me. Here's the thing. I tell people this all the time. I am an introvert. I am terrified of public speaking. And I get the feedback all the time that I look so calm and confident when I'm speaking, when I'm performing. And I think, well, that's because you're not inside my head. You can do this. You can be completely panicked and you can still do it. And the way to do it is the practice. And I honestly feel like if you practice it enough, even when you have all those nerves going on, when it's time to perform, the words still come out because of all that time you spent rehearsing the poems over and over again and really internalizing them. So I have so much fun with it. This is such Poetry Out Loud. I can't say enough about it. It's so cool. I'm so glad that I get to be part of it. I've gotten to judge it before, and now I get to do this part, and it's so fun. I hope you guys have fun and enjoy it because it is amazing to watch you all perform. It's just so cool.
Oh, it's the best. Well, if you all have any questions, after this workshop, please feel free to reach out to us. We would be happy to answer any of your questions, give you feedback, any of that good stuff. So please let us know. Mandie, you have been awesome. Thank you so much for all of your advice and tips and tricks for our students. We're so excited to have you, and we will hopefully see you all later in February and maybe at the state competition in March.
Yes.
Yay!
Awesome.
All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.